right, so I'm on the board of the League of Women Voters in here in Reading, and President Kim Rodney is here, but no, say hi to her. She's awesome. I want to extend the League's thanks to Matt Knickerbocker and to Marketing Library, and especially Elaine, who helps all of us with these awesome programs. So I've seen Matt in this very room captivate an audience talking about how New England governance evolved and works and why everybody needs to participate. It is definitely not boring. Matt rose, it is not, it's fascinating. He rose from a volunteer in Bethel to the first selectman of town Bethel for 13 years. Yeah. And currently provides the role of town manager in Wilton. We do not have a town manager, but he will explain how those things differ. And just a side note, for over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has promoted education and participation, like this talk tonight. The League empowers voters by helping them understand issues and facts, and that's why we have things like debates. We are nonpartisan. We greatly appreciate our first select woman, Julia Pemberton, being here with us tonight to further the discussion and to answer any questions about Reading. And let's go, Matt.
Great, thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, everybody. You know, I have to just say one thing on Elaine's admonition to be careful about what you say because the microphones are very sensitive. I remember at the beginning of the dawn of the Zoom age, where we had microphones, I was participating in a meeting and there were two Board of Finance members who were whispering, and one was explaining his recent prostate surgery. It went everywhere, so do be mindful of that. So thank you thanks to the League of Women Voters, thank you to the library. Julie is great. Julie is one of my favorite first selectmen of all time. She does a great job. It's great to see you. Glad you're here. Especially if I screw up, you can help bail me out. So.
No chance of that.
So we always do the bona fide. So this is kind of what I've done since I got involved in public service. This does not include the 10 years I spent as a member of the Bethel Board of Education. I spent 7 years as chair doing that. I want to tell you, any Board of Ed members here? Okay, I probably shouldn't tell you this. That's actually harder than being first selectman, especially if you're chair. But do run for it if you're interested. It's an experience everybody should have. Before I did all this stuff, I had a corporate career that lasted about 33 years. The industry I was in was film and cameras. Remember those things? You can find them in museums now. So when the end finally came, they gave me some money and said, go away. So I said, you know, I was going to run for first selectman someday, so maybe I'll do that now. So 15, 16 years later, this is what we did. And I want to talk a little bit about why I created this little course that we run, which I run for the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities after every municipal election cycle to kind of give newly elected people an idea of what they've gotten themselves into if they don't already know. And what had happened was, and just a little bit about my background, I moved here, my wife and I moved here in 1992 from the state of Michigan, and I came here and I went to work. Like most people, I got up very early in the morning, I got on a train, I went to New York City, I would come back, and I would come home and my wife would say, you have to come with me to a town meeting. I have never seen anything like that in my life. And I said, what's the big deal? Because I came from a town that was actually half the size of Bethel, and like everything else in the Midwest, it had a city council, it had a mayor. You know, once in a while they'd have a referendum on something, like they wanted to put up a new high school, okay, so they had a referendum about that. But for the most part, the city council just voted on stuff, you know. It didn't require its citizens to be part-time participants in their government all the time. And I became fascinated by that, so I spent a lot of time, actually went after being elected to position of first selectman, I went back to grad school and I got a master's degree in public administration, and I took some public policy classes too. Really, and I spent a lot of time figuring out how this whole thing came about, because what we do here in New England is so unique. It literally does not exist anywhere else in the world. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, I know we have some very experienced, very competent participants in town government sitting right here. I will try not to bore you, because you know I'm sure you know how all this stuff works. So what we're going to do tonight is talk a little bit about what those other forms of government are. By the way, is everybody here Connecticut native? See, now this is interesting. One of the reasons I did this is in my years as first selectman, I would go around to it's budget season, as you know. I would go around with our superintendent of schools to all the parent support groups, and I would put up a thing that would say, okay, now Tuesday is your public hearing, and you really need to go to that. And then about a week later, we're going to have a town meeting, and you definitely have to go to that, because that's where you vote. And then after that, we're going to have a referendum, and if the referendum is passed, we're going to do all this stuff over again. And I would look out at a sea of bewildered faces. So finally, I started saying out of a group about this size, how many people grew up here? Like, maybe I would get 2 hands. So then I would say, well, where did you come from? And they would say, Boston, Detroit, whatever. And I said, so did you have mayors? Oh yeah, we had mayors. So it dawned on me that we have a moving population. People are migrating within the United States, and people come here and they don't know how this works. And I can tell you, I knew nothing. It took my wife about 3 years to get me involved in it. Then I was hooked. And I've never missed a town meeting except for the one time they had the flu, but they gave me a pass for that. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this came to be, what the differences are, why that matters, and most importantly, and I'm really glad that Julie is here to back this up, why we need you, and we need more people like you to take an interest in this, to keep it going. So just a couple of background things, and I apologize if this is just from high school civics, that you already know this stuff. They sometimes call the governmental system in the United States the layer cake, because there are multiple layers that they kind of overlap a little bit. Maybe marble cake would be a better example. But obviously, you've got the federal level, state level, county. We don't have those here, but most places do. 48 states have counties, 2 don't. And what they do. And then we have municipalities. And there are all kinds of municipalities, and there are all kinds of ways that they function around the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about counties just for a minute. Counties exist in most states, not New England. For the most part, they are administrative arms of the state. So they exist as an independent layer of government, but they, with rare exceptions, they don't do a lot of legislating. They do a few rules and regulations here and there, but for the most part, they are there to administer state functions on a regional level, which is designed to save money. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about Connecticut. Connecticut made counties go away. And now, when we get to the end of this, we're going to talk a little bit about regionalization. Now they're trying to put them back together in a way and not call them counties, because that's a bad word. But what they're trying to do is get some regional efficiency. So, like where I grew up in Michigan, we actually had another layer below counties that were called townships. So there were unincorporated areas. So there'd be a township administrator who, they did the things like arrange for roads to be plowed and salted and things like that. It was strictly administrative. But what happened when counties went away is that now every town has to repeat the same services over and over. So everybody's got their own health department, they got their own assessor, they've got their own health inspectors, building inspectors, and so on, whereas in other states, many of those services are spread over a wider area, so they kind of, it tends to take a little bit of the bite out of the tax burden. Municipalities also administer state things, but they also have legislative power to do things locally. within certain limits, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. So how is it that we get to do things like take money from you and charge you taxes, give you a speeding ticket, all this stuff? Government authority, of course, extends from the late 1700s with the adoption of the Constitution. Power comes from the people who created that Constitution and adopted it. And the Constitution is very specific about some things and not so specific about others. Specifically, the Constitution created the framework for state governments and said there shall be states and the states will be responsible for this. And then they said, anything we forgot to mention here, we'll just leave to the states. So they delineated federal powers, then they delineated state powers, and they said if there's something we missed, then the states will take care of it, we don't want to be bothered. They never mentioned local. And initially in the formation of the Republic, local governments had no power at all. They couldn't even do things like borrow money. So the things that we take for granted today, like floating a bond issue to build a school or roads, they could do none of that stuff. So it became the role of the states to decide how they want their local governments to work and what form they would take. So local governments like ours here are authorized under state law. The main power is embedded in what they call the legislative body. And this will make all perfect sense if you're not already familiar with this. The legislative body is the group of people, whether it's everybody in this room or an elected representative group, that have the power to do that. You know, they take an oath of office, they run for office, and once they are installed in office as a group, that legislative body does all the legislating, makes the major decisions. And there's different types of legislative bodies. At the federal level, obviously, and this is like a review from high school, it's the United States Congress. We elect people, because you can't put 330 million people in a room for a town meeting, so you elect people they represent their district, their state, they go to Washington D.C. and they represent our interests there. State level works exactly the same way. We're broken up into Senate districts and representative districts. It's a representative form of democracy, and they represent our interests, and they have the power to do all these, do the legislative things. Municipal level can be different. We have councils, and we have town meeting form of government. And this is where things really start to get a little bit interesting. So in the United States, there are three basic levels there are three basic forms of local government. The one that was, through most of American history, the most predominant is the mayor-council form of government. There is a newer version that was invented in the early 20th century. I think the first town to adopt a council-manager form of government, which we'll talk about in greater detail in a couple of minutes, was a town in Ohio, and I think it was like 1927. And we'll go into reasons of why that became what it is. And then we have what we do here, selectmen town meeting form of government. So mayor city council is pretty much what it says, like I was describing. I grew up in Michigan. We didn't have town meetings. We would have public hearings once in a while, but the vast majority of local governments would have a representative council. So just like Congress, just like your state legislature, and of course, cities like Danbury, most of the larger cities in Connecticut have this form of government. So you elect council members who represent their ward or their district within the city. They represent the legislative side of the traditional triangle of power in the governmental structure. You have an elected mayor who represents the executive branch. And then they usually have local courts or things in most parts of the country that represents the judicial branch. And that is, it kind of matches the constitutional form with the three branches of government. It's clean, it's easy to understand. People elect their representatives, they go and do their thing. There are some permutations in there. The mayor, some mayors have a vote under city council, others are completely separate. They can't vote on them. And again, it's easy to understand because it conforms with the separation of powers. There's also permutations within this called strong mayor or weak mayor. First time I did this, somebody said, well, that's not a nice thing to say. No, it's not a character reference on the people in the office. A strong mayor, as you see over here, and I've on all these slides, I've coded the legislative body, the people that have the actual power, in yellow, so you can just see the difference. With the strong mayor system, you can see that the voters elect the council and the mayor. They're very independent. The mayor has complete control to appoint most of the other functions of government. So, planning, zoning, education, things like that fall under the mayor, with some exceptions. Most of the if you look at the 10 largest cities in the US, so, Boston, New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, so on, you will find that they are universally strong mayor structures. You might remember, if you are kind of a government junkie like me, when Mayor Bloomberg got into trouble trying to take over the Board of Education in New York City a number like 10 or 15 years ago, and that didn't work out very well. That was the one branch of government that he could not completely control out of his office. He didn't like it, and it's still pretty much set up that way. The weak mayor system is what you'll find in most medium to smaller cities. So you'll see that the mayor has a dotted line relationship with the council. The mayor can make recommendations to the council. Sometimes the council has to vote on who the mayor, the mayor might give several candidates for something and the council is limited to that vote. Other times, it's more wide open, but the council has the final say with how the department heads are structured. Council manager is a very interesting form of government. This began as I mentioned, in the early 20th century, and this is structured the same way your Board of Education is structured. So you have a superintendent of schools, and that superintendent is not elected. You elect your Board of Education, and they hire a degreed licensed professional to run your school district. And that's usually required in most states, that there are licensing requirements, and of course, you will not find a superintendent of schools that does not hold a PhD or multiple PhDs and have extensive experience in school leadership. The council manager form of government was formed pretty much the same way. Council is elected. Usually it's a representative council, broken up into wards and districts within the city. And then that city hires a degreed professional manager to run the place. This was a concept that actually, it came from writings in the early 1900s, actually by Woodrow Wilson. Late 1800s, I think, is when he started writing about this. And he posed a question, and you have to kind of put your mindset back in the late 1800s, late part of this. As I mentioned, towns didn't really have any authority to do much. There was an evolutionary process underway that they didn't really have a lot of independent authority. In some cases, they didn't have any authority. The mayor would frequently give his or her buddy, I'm going to say his, but back then, women didn't count for much, unfortunately, and we know that. I mean, this is long before the 19th Amendment was passed. So there was a lot of political patronism going on to do what limited things that could be done at the local level, and there was a lot of corruption. The mayor would give his buddies jobs to do, they may or may not be competent, there was graft. And Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the university at the time, said, why shouldn't there be professional management just like business? And he was equating a business governance model to local government. It was specifically local government that he was writing about. So he posed this idea that there should be professional managers who, because the world was getting complicated, the Industrial Revolution was roaring along. The dollars at stake and the needs at the local level were blossoming. Henry Ford was cranking out cars. You needed roads to drive those cars on. There were railroads that needed to be, since the mid-1800s. So there was all this need, and it wasn't happening very efficiently. So Wilson said, we need professional management. So over a period of time, the council manager form of government was proposed, and then the first one, as I said, in the late 1920s, began operation, and now we'll see in a minute that is more prevalent than any other form of government. So you can see that this is a very clean structure. The voters elect a council. The council is the legislative body. They have a manager. Manager functions as the chief elected official or chief executive officer so it has the same powers and duties as your elected CEO. And in fact, in Connecticut law, town managers, and I'm not one of these. My role is management, but I'm a town administrator by title. Towns that have a town manager, the state recognizes that manager with the same power and authority as Julia has. Now we get to the fun stuff, the selectmen. This is the oldest form of government in the US. It dates back to literally the early colonial period in the early 1600s. And it is still based today, even though we live in a more complicated world where we have permutations of this and we have exceptions to handle the much larger population. But this is based on direct rather than representative democracy. So even today, Julia is elected at large. She doesn't represent one part of the town. The other selectmen on her board are also elected at large. So it's not a representative form. I put up here, this exists almost exclusively. For practical purposes, it is exclusive to New England. And this evolved from 1600 church governance. If you ever wondered why when you drive around New England, there's always a big white congregational church with the nice steeple. That was government in the colonial day. That's before there were town governments, that's what ran the town. Which is very interesting. I've always wondered why, as the colonies, as the republic formed and people spread westward, they didn't take town meeting government with them, which is I find very interesting. There were some writings, historical writings I found of some people that left New England, went to California, tried it for a while, and said, nah, we want a mayor and a council. We don't want to do this anymore. So it didn't translate to the rest of the country, but we like our steady habits here, and we're still making it work. And this is the major point, and this is why I'm so thrilled to see this room full of people and the folks online. It requires a lot of people. You cannot run town meeting government without dozens and dozens of volunteers who are willing to sacrifice a little bit of time. I won't tell you how much, because I want you to run. I want you to get a clipboard, decide what you're interested in, and go run. Because we need you. Every town that has this needs you. So this evolved from 17th century church governance. So selectmen were the elders of the church. Sometimes they're called aldermen. I'm stressing the word men because, when you think about it, even in a town of, let me just take my adopted town, Bethel. When it was incorporated in 1855, it had 1,500 people. Now, even in Bethel, back in those days, there was no church big enough to put 1,500 people to go in and vote. So how did that work? Well, think about it in the, say the late 17th, early 18th centuries, early 19th centuries, who could vote?
And white men who own
White
land.
men who own property. If you've anybody been to the LOB, the Legislative Office Building, so if the long tunnel that goes over to the Capitol, fascinating. I had a picture of a poster. There's a great big piece of art, which I wanted to include in this, and I lost it. My phone crashed and I lost a bunch of pictures. It is a picture of who could vote in New England in 1796. And it was white men who owned a certain level of property. You had to be a landowner. but women couldn't vote, emancipated slaves couldn't vote, indigenous Americans couldn't vote. So in a town of 1,500, you could probably have maybe no more than 30 or 40 people who actually had the power to vote. So that's how they got away with that form of government. One of the things I found fascinating is I read that public, we talk a lot today, especially about separation of church and state. The last church built with tax money was erected in 1806, so which is kind of incomprehensible today, but it was. So that back in those days, as I mentioned, there really wasn't local government, especially in New England. There was no some historians today say that not only was there no separation of church and state, the church was the local government. And of course, you can see what's happening here. They had a lot of power. They had the power to condemn a person to death. Of course, there's been more press about this lately, but anybody know who the first witch executed was? Alice Young, outside of Hartford. I think it was in Glastonbury. 50 years before the Salem witch trials. So Connecticut has the dubious distinction of being where the first witch execution took place in the colonies. So the main features of town meeting government is that the legislative body is comprised of all of you. And in this form of government, it tends to be very, very decentralized. That's why I say when it takes dozens and dozens of volunteers to make it work, that's why. Unlike most mayors, even in a weak mayor system, first select persons actually have quite limited executive power. They can't do much compared to the other, because remember we talked about the three branches of government. Here's the legislative part, here's the executive part, and here's the judicial part. In town meeting government, a lot of those things are mixed up, and what that does is it dilutes the power of the first selectman. So they can't do a lot of things that mayors can do. It's significantly decentralized, and power is often shared between multiple elected boards. And to make matters even more complicated, once you get on one of these boards, oftentimes they work pretty much independently from one another. I remember, separation of powers is unclear. I remember, I think, Julie, you may have gone through this too, but people coming to me when I was first selected with Bethel, and they're saying, BJ's Wholesale Club wants to put a gigantic thing right on Route 6, and it's gonna mess up traffic, and it's gonna destroy our quality of life. You gotta go stop that. And I would have to say, no, you gotta go stop that. Because the Planning and Zoning Board, by state law, is independent. I can't tell them how to make their decisions. And when they came to me sometime later with a petition to have a town meeting to overturn a decision by the Planning and Zoning Board. By the way, BJ's went up to Brookfield, I didn't have to worry about it. But when people came to me one day with a petition and said, we want to overturn this apartment complex that was approved by Planning and Zoning, I said, can't help you. Because under state law, that board operates independently. A town does not have to have a planning board. If it doesn't have one, then those decisions fall to the Board of Selectmen. But if it has one, and it's in your charter to have a planning board, then the only way you can there's only two methods. You have to file an appeal with the Zoning Board of Appeals, and you can overturn a decision that way, maybe. And if you don't like that decision, you must file a lawsuit in Superior Court. But a town meeting cannot overturn them. The Board of Selectmen cannot overturn them. Sometimes they even have their own budget to do certain things. Like they might collect fees, say for sidewalks or something, and they would have a budget for purchasing open space, and it's completely separate. So that is one of the hallmarks of town meeting government, is that there are boards that function independently. So just to give you make your head spin a little bit, this isn't even everything. This is a typical list of things within a town meeting government that you have to find enough volunteers to make them run. So, anybody interested in We'll take names because there's an election coming up in the fall. And I think you might want to be a part of that. Structure of town meeting is, as I said, decentralized and confusing. Just to show you how that compares, this is a weak mayor city council, which is predominantly the types that exist in the US on the left side. And you can see it's very clean. The voters elect those people in the council, they elect the mayor, the council appoints the board and commissions, the mayor's office runs things. Now look at the town meeting. You've got voters, they elect boards. Notice that those things aren't connected, like the elected boards. They don't report to anybody else, and nobody can tell them what to do. Then you've got the Board of Selectmen, you've got the First Selectman. The First Selectman actually is part of the Board of Selectmen. So the First Selectman legislates with them, but then also runs things. The First Selectman has some control over making nominations to boards, to other boards and commissions, but the Board of Selectmen has the final say. So this is why I developed this little seminar for newly elected people for CCM, because people would often show up for their first time in office thinking they could do certain things that they couldn't. So we kind of had to straighten that out. Now, to confuse things even more, there is now a hybrid form of town meeting government. What is one of, I'll just throw this question out. What's one of the pitfalls of town meeting government in the 21st century where, you know, say the Board of Selectmen, Julia and her board, cannot vote to appropriate that $900,000 for a fire truck. You have to have a town meeting. So what's the pitfall in that?
Larger towns.
What's that?
Larger towns.
Yeah,
Yelling and screaming.
well,
That small group can just take over.
there you are. I always referred to it as government by people who show up.
Yeah.
And I was actually, I use a fire truck example because I can remember in the mid-90s, Bethel was voting on a $700,000 fire truck. By the way, they run about $1.5 million now, inflation. But there were only 5 of us that showed up, including the lady from Comcast who lived in Bethel who was running the camera. So the 5 of us, fortunately, we were interested in fire trucks, so we voted to approve the fire trucks, and the fire truck was purchased. There were many other times in my personal experience in Bethel where somebody decided to stack a special town meeting, and typically we would have no more than 10 or 15 people, and there were things that got voted down. So so my suspicion is that town meeting government did not translate to the rest of the country because people didn't want that to happen. They wanted to have representative people who would show up and be responsible for that. Therefore, what some towns have done is they've come up with this hybrid that they call representative town meeting. So just to use Greenwich as an example, when they have municipal elections, there are people who run to be a representative town meeting member. And they commit to show up for all the town meetings. So instead of having 5 people approving your fire truck, you've got, in their case, 240.
Oh, my goodness.
Can you imagine? Basically, they become the city council with 240 people. And they break themselves up into committees and subcommittees, and I am told, because I've not been part of one, that they micromanage things. To me, personally, it sounds like a nightmare. I'd rather have a city council, but they make this work. There are several towns in Connecticut that have RTMs, representative town meetings, and they do their thing, and it works.
It takes hours and hours and hours to have one meeting.
Yes, yeah,
They can run 5 hours.
yeah. Anyway, so 6 towns have adopted RTMs. I think they're mostly down on the coast, like, you know, Greenwich and a couple others have them down there. Darien, that's right.
Westport.
Right. So I'll take that org chart for a typical town meeting government, and we throw that in there. So now you've got voters as, they still represent the legislative body, but now they also have representative town meeting. So, they still have referendums where the legislative body, everybody votes, then you have the representative town meeting where the 240 people or whoever get to do their thing. So it's, again, we like our steady habits in Connecticut, but they make it work. Then there are special boroughs and special taxing districts. And those exist, this is a relatively recent addition to state law, and they're usually there for special purposes. Anybody here live in the Georgetown district? Georgetown? So you're in a special taxing district that pays for the fire service, and that's common. Out of the 169 towns in Connecticut, there are currently 305 special taxing districts. Some of them were organized for particular reasons, such as there's a neighborhood down on the river, studying a neighborhood that's on the waterfront in Greenwich, beautiful place. So they formed a special, so I think their mill rate for that area, well, the whole town, I think at the time that I did this little research was 11. Very high property values there. So in this neighborhood, they have access to a beach and some amenities there. They got together. So they formed a special taxing district to pay for that. So they have like a 1.5 point surcharge on top of that for those amenities. So those are some of the reasons. Special taxing districts can exist for any reason, but that's what those are used for. So here's how things shake out. This is interesting to me because up until about the 1960s, the mayor-city council form of local government was the predominant form of local government in the United States. But as I said, starting in the late 20s, this council manager form of government started to pick up steam, and now it is not quite 2/3 of all local governments in America. I have to stop and tell you a really funny story. A number of years ago, I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico for a conference, the National League of Cities. It was in the springtime, about this time of year, and I was there with several of my colleagues, other first selectmen from Connecticut. And the morning of the general session, we were having breakfast and sitting at a big table. And these 3 guys from Minnesota came and said, "Can we sit with you guys?" Yeah, sure. So we were chatting, and I looked at my watch and I said, "Oh, I have to remember to call in to see how things are going." We were having a referendum that day. So these guys from Minnesota said, "Oh, that's exciting. What are you building, a new park or school or something?" I said, "No, it's our budget." And they said, "You what?" You have a referendum? You mean everybody votes on your budget? I said, "Yeah." "You mean your city council doesn't just vote on your budget?" Said, "We don't have a city council. We've got a 3-member board of selectmen." They were dumbfounded by that. So the funny part is about 3 hours later, I was going into a room for one of the breakout sessions, and I'm sitting at this table, and I hear this guy behind me talking. As these men are walking in, I hear this guy saying, "Yeah, I was sitting with these guys from Connecticut this morning. You wouldn't believe what they have to do. I don't know how they get anything done." I turned around and it was one of the guys from Minnesota. It was hilarious. So you can see that town meeting form of government is still predominant in Connecticut as in most of New England. It's down to 6% nationally, and they're all pretty much here. Let's talk just for a little bit about regionalism, because as I mentioned, we used to have counties. I don't think, I wasn't here in the 60s. I was at St. Mary's School in Royal Oak, Michigan back then, in about the 5th grade, but I understand that county government was actually not much in Connecticut, that we had county marshals, we had sheriffs, and we had like a county jail system. In most cases though, counties are a lot more active. My son-in-law taught for a number of years in Louisville, Kentucky, in the Jefferson County School District. So that incorporated all of the city of Louisville and the suburbs, and that was, that the county maintained the entire school district with one superintendent, and then they had, assistant superintendents and principals, but rather than the city of Louisville and all of its surrounding suburbs having their own system, that was incorporated into one. Same thing where I grew up, we had a county road commission, and they were responsible. So the town that I was in, they had a small road crew that did some local stuff on the streets downtown, but for all the rural roads, this was all handled by the county road commission. So now I am told, and I read, and I did a lot of reading on this at the state level through the Commission on Intergovernment Relations, that the reason that Connecticut abandoned its county system is they weren't happy with the marshals, and they weren't happy with the fact that they had to pay a tax on top of their local tax. So they swept it away. So as I mentioned, for the last 15 years, there's been a very concerted effort on the part of one governor after another to try to sweep some of that stuff back together for regional efficiencies. And the reason for this is that the state spends a lot of money giving it to local governments. So your school district gets educational cost sharing money. You get money from the Pequot Fund. You get money from Town Aid Road. There are steep grants that are given out to towns. That stands for Small Town Economic Assistance Program. There is LOCIP, local,
Capital improvement.
local capital improvement. You need to build things. Then there's LOTSIP, which is local transportation improvement. So when the state, this happened most recently when Daniel Malloy was in office, when the state found itself in real trouble, budget-wise. Oh, and let's not forget the teacher pension. And we'll talk about that in a minute too. But when the state was in deep trouble with its budget, one of the things they looked at each other and said, well, we gotta find a way to not have to give so much money to the towns. Now, the first selectmen and town managers and mayors disagree with that. We think that they're not giving enough. And it is true that the state of Connecticut, compared to other states, relies on local funding for essential services to a far greater degree than most other states. But the effort has been to try to wean the towns off of all this assistance. And one of the ways they want to do that is they say, why don't you guys kind of get together with the other towns and regionalize some things? So in other words, they're trying to bring back the concept of county government without actually making a county government. So what they did, when I first was elected in 2009, there was these things, there were 15 regional councils around the state. And they did certain things. They were involved in some transportation stuff and some health district stuff. But there were two different types. There were councils of elected officials. For a while, I was chair of what was called the HEVCO, the Housatonic Valley Council of Elected Officials. That was like northern Fairfield County and some towns in southern Litchfield County was in this group. Down south of us, there was a thing. It was not a council of elected officials. It was a different thing called a regional planning authority. So along the coast and up as far as Wilton and Weston, there was an organization called SWRPA, which stood for the Southwest Regional Planning Authority. They were not elected officials. They were appointed, and they were mostly involved in regional planning. So, and of course you can imagine in Fairfield County, which is a very densely populated area, it becomes problematic if one town's planning authority is putting a very nasty industrial facility of some kind, allowing it to be built right on the border next to a very nice area in the neighboring town. So the regional planning authorities were to try to get everybody together to coordinate those things for consistency across those. So in 2014, the state came along, they passed a new law, and they said, all right, we're abolishing all those things. So we're making all the CEOs go away, and we're making all the RPAs go away. And what we want instead is a group of councils of governments, and they will all be structured the same way. They will have the CEO of each town will be a member of the board. Nobody else can do that. They will have responsibility to do a lot of things. The primary thing that they do is manage transportation money, so on a regional basis. But then since these things, so these have existed now we're in the 11th year, the state has thrown one incentive after another to try to get towns to use the Council of Governments to regionalize services. It hasn't worked very well so far. There are some things that they do, but the state, because of pushback at the local level, mostly the state has been very reluctant to pass a law that just says, all right, quit arguing, we're just gonna make you do it. In fact, early on in my tenure as first selectman, right after I joined CCM, Connecticut Council, Conference of Municipalities, at that time, Bill Finch was the president of CCM, and of course, he was the mayor of Bridgeport for a long time. And I remember, this was in 2013, 2014, when the state was debating this. Bill stood up in one of the CCM meetings where there were legislators, and he says, he says to the legislators, if you guys want counties, just pass a law and make counties again. And I thought that if anybody had tomatoes, they would have thrown it at him, because nobody wanted counties. But at the same time, the state is still trying to incentivize local communities like ours, like Reading, to try to regionalize services. It's a very difficult thing to do voluntarily. So they've made some progress, but it hasn't gone as well as they want. So this is what the county, this is what they call it the COG, the Council of Government Structure, looks like. And you can see that if it looks familiar, it's because they the geographic boundaries kind of look a little bit like the original counties, except if you count those things, there's 9 of them. There used to be 8 counties. So what's up with that? Well, there's, this one right here, Metropolitan COG. The way they structured the law to try to get all the local elected officials on board with this, because nobody was happy about it. What they said was, well, we want these councils of governments, and they said to all the first selectmen and mayors, you can decide who you want in your group, to a degree. I mean, if you're New Canaan or something, you can't decide you're gonna be part of Naugatuck Valley, but if you're on the border, so there was a lot of negotiating going on, because there were some people here in our area, and I had the misfortune of still being chair when they did this, of HEVCO. There were some people up here who said, okay, if we're gonna do this, we don't want anything to do with Bridgeport. We don't want them in the state wanted, I'll show this border, the state of Connecticut wanted this border to go just like that, and and that would have matched Fairfield County. And there was huge, I remember Susan Weissowitz came and had a meeting with me, and Ben Barnes, I don't know if you remember Ben Barnes. He's still mad at me about that, because I could not talk my colleagues up here in the Western Connecticut Council of Governments to accept Bridgeport. I don't know why. I felt very bad about that. Bridgeport's actually a nice place, and there's lots of nice people down there. So they split off, and these 6 towns became their own COG. So the state wanted 8, we got 9. So anyway, that's the story there. Just as a sidebar, politics gets really strange sometimes, as you can imagine. As I mentioned, one of the major things that these councils do is they do transport. That's probably more than, I would say 60 to 75% of their function is managing transportation funds. So within that structure of all those councils of government, there's a second layer in there called MPOs. Those stand for Metropolitan Planning Organizations. And there's more of them than there are COGs. Like our Council of Governments here in Western Connecticut actually has 2 separate MPOs. And the reason that it's set up that way is that MPOs are established under federal law, not state. And the councils of governments are set up under state law. So when Julia and her colleagues have a council of governments meeting, they will convene, so there's 18 towns or 14? 18. So all of the CEOs are in this big room, and there's a chairperson and a vice chair, and they call the meeting to order. But if you ever attend one of these things, you'll notice that everybody from the south side, the south end of the COG sits on one side, and then all the people from northern Fairfield come sit on the other side, because they're like a big horseshoe, so they're looking at each other. So then when the Council of Government meeting is over, then the chairperson will get up and go join their group, and the chair of each of the 2 MPOs will then assume the position at the head of the table, and they will each call their meeting to order separately, and they will conduct their business, which is usually voting on almost the same thing on each side, and then there will be 2 sets of minutes. So this is, so it gets complicated. Yes, sir?
The CEOs of the COGs are appointed by, or they're voted in?
They are the elected CEOs from each town.
So we elect a CEO?
It's the
Oh, it's the first
selectman.
selectman, okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
Mayor or
It's the mayor, CEO,
It's the
or,
mayor, the mayor or the first selectman, or in some cases, the town manager, if it's a town manager form of government, we don't have that,
Right.
so. That's an interesting question though, because when the COG was first formed, I had the misfortune of being one of the 2 first selectmen who did the bylaws for the first one too. I can't say no, it's a problem I have, but anyway. So when we formed the Western Connecticut Council of Governments, initially, the local authority was allowed to appoint somebody to represent the CEO. And there was one city in which the mayor never showed up. I think, in fact, it wasn't even an elected person, it was their chief of staff from one of the bigger cities. So the COG then adjusted its bylaws and said the representative to the COG must be elected. You have to be an elected official to do it. So in 100% of the cases on the Western COG, Western Connecticut COG, the main representative is the first selectman or mayor, and then if they can't make it, they usually appoint a backup from their board of selectmen.
is there a regional chairman of the COGs?
Yes.
In each of the districts?
Yep.
In each of the,
And-
okay.
They're elected by the COG.
By their
Yeah,
COGs.
once a year they will
the
elect.
chair of the MPO also.
Yeah.
Chairman.
Yeah, so once a year they will elect 3 people, the Council of Governments will elect 3 people, 1 chair for the whole thing, and then 1 chair for each of the 2 MPOs. Now, the other councils of governments don't have that same structure. I think Western Connecticut is the only one that has 2 separate NPOs within its structure.
Let's do Stanford. That was Stanford's doing.
That was Stanford's doing. And there were efforts to try to change that, but as I mentioned, it's chartered under federal law, so you literally have to go to the United States Congress, which, go see the Pope instead, because that would probably be more productive. So it was actually, yes, Mayor David Martin,
Yes.
who thought that an MPO structure that made sense for Lower Fairfield County would be actually crossing state lines, like from Westchester County, from New York City up to New Haven, because that's the rail corridor, and it's the I-95 corridor. Made a lot of sense, could not make it happen. And we talked to our senators about it, and Congress is just busy doing other stuff, so we never got there. I'm gonna talk a little bit and I'm not gonna get too deep into the weeds on this, but I find it fascinating. Anybody hear of home rule? We're big on home rule in Connecticut. We like to be independent. We like to just run things our own way. Well, as I mentioned, states really decide, states have 100% authority to decide if you are allowed to have a town government, and if you have one, what form will it take? And now some states do not allow any deviation whatsoever. They structure in state law, you will have a city council, you will have a mayor, you will have this, you will have that. That's how it's gonna be. Other states, Connecticut being one, allows some deviation in that. They allow some level of local control. So those are called home rule states. And within certain structures, and it differs by state, municipalities can adopt a charter and change their form of government. Those who don't follow, the basic principle is Dillon's rule. Judge Dillon is a very interesting character. He was a late 19th century lawyer. He was actually a lawyer who, in the heyday of the railroad construction era, when the governments were giving land to the railroads for the purpose of economic expansion. And he later became a judge. And at this particular time, you know, as the country is expanding, the Civil War is over, there's economic booms, there's land being developed, the railroads are pushing people, taking people out west. Local governments had a lot of pressure. You know, they actually had to start providing services, whether it was water or waste removal or roads and so on. And they were pushing for more authority. Back in those days, a town could not do anything on its own at all. So if there was a local issue to be decided, they had to send representatives to the state legislature and get the legislature to vote to allow them to do something. So it got to the point where state legislatures were doing so much of that work, they couldn't get any of their own work done. So then they decided, maybe we'd give them some latitude and let them do things on their own. But Judge Dillon was a Supreme Court justice in Iowa, and he was famous for tamping down any efforts for a very long time for local government to have any authority. So Dillon's rule is still in effect in many parts of the country, which is, unless the state says you can do it specifically in specific language, then you can't do anything. I don't think local towns were allowed to participate in the municipal bond market. I mean, municipal bond market was literally created to help towns. That did not occur till the late 1800s. So towns could not raise money other than local taxes. They couldn't borrow. So state legislatures finally started easing up a little bit. They granted some authority to local towns. It was not incorporated into Connecticut law until the 1960s. You can see up there, it was adopted via a constitutional amendment in 1969. And then following that, then there were laws that were put on the books. And they're still making adjustments to it. But in chapter 99 of state code book, CGS, you will find the outline for how home rule will work. Basically, it says that a town can adopt a charter. And you can specify how you want, you can remain town meeting government, you can be a town council manager, you can set things up, you know, there's pretty wide latitude to set it up. There are towns in Connecticut that don't have charters, and if they don't, then there's no such thing as home rule for them. They must follow traditional town meeting form of government as it's specified in state law. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about that, though. Connecticut is mostly home rule, but you can only do things that can legally be fitted into a charter.
Reading has a charter.
What's that?
Reading has a charter.
Nope.
No.
Nope. So you're following the traditional state law. So, which it makes it easy. So, and charters, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with them. Basically, it's our local constitution. It outlines how things are going to work. And that is the basic presentation. And let me just close with my pitch. Lori's out there, she's gonna take names on what board or commission you wanna run for. We're gonna sign you up.
Can't get out the drawer?
Well, you know, I remember one day I had a letter in the mail from the Bethel Town Clerk, and it says, "Congratulations on being appointed a Justice of the Peace." I said, I didn't do that. So I went to one of the town committee meetings, and, you know, one of the elder statesmen there said, "Oh yeah," he says, "I just signed you up along with everybody else." So that led to Board of Ed, then led to a lot of things, and here I am. So I will tell you that the time I spent on the Board of Education, the time I spent as first selectman, is the most rewarding things I've ever done. Should have done it sooner. So with that, I will thank you very much for your attention. I kept it to 1 hour and 1 minute. And please run for something. Anything you want. Julia will, and all of the citizens, your fellow citizens will appreciate it. So thank you very much.